Yeah. Never mind. Okay. Okay.
So good morning.
I see
Good morning,
she
everyone.
wrote back. It's okay.
Technology.
Good morning, everybody.
I just got off a really wonderful Zoom with like 180 people from the Hand in Hand School.
Oh, yes, yes.
Rabbi school, and you know, they're under enormous pressure during this, at the same time that evidently there was a march of extremists through Jerusalem, kill Arabs. They were hosting a program in the Knesset for school principals about
Well, do people know about this? I think you should just give a little summary. We've been sponsors since the very beginning, and you know.
So yeah, the Yad B'Yad schools, I think most of you are familiar with. There are about 4 or 5, maybe even 6 of these schools. The first one in Jerusalem, that half the students are Jewish Israelis and half the students are Arab Israelis. And they teach all classes, both in Hebrew and in Arabic. The kids grow up. The kids really grow up together, knowing each other. And one of the wonderful aspects of this is it's not only a school for kids, the parents are all engaged in,
Yes.
In programs as well. So it's
and it was organized by this young man who grew up in Portland.
Lee Gordon. Lee Gordon was one of the founders, yes. And he was.
They now have 7,000 students.
Pardon me?
They now have 7,000 students.
7,000 students. Well, you know, 7,000 people who are you know, dealing with this, or parent families are dealing with this conflict every day. Evidently, I was told a number of years ago, it is much easier to round up the Arab parents than to round up the Jewish parents. Now remember, these are all Israeli citizens. These are not people from the territories. The reason that they say is because the Arab parents are looking for the best education possible. And the Jewish parents are somewhat hesitant, not about the education, but about what it means. I know that when Carol and I were at the Neve Shalom community, which is a Jewish Arab Israeli community, there were some people who said that one of the reasons that people are hesitant about that community is they're terrified that their kids might fall in love with each other.
I have
And that's date each other, and that's while might be a problem here, it's a huge problem in Israel. Nevertheless, you know, I would think of you as lucky if you had only strong feelings pro-Israel, and probably lucky if you only had strong feelings pro-Palestinian, because I think that the rest of us are unlucky in that we are very conflicted in terms of our love of Israel and our discomfort over all that we're seeing there. One note that I'd add that I've only seen in one place, and I think that there's probably more legitimacy to it than I thought about before. And that is why is it taking longer to get a ceasefire? The longer there is no ceasefire, the more trouble it will be, maybe impossible, for the opposition to form a coalition. Now they only have 4 weeks, and every day that passes makes the forming of an opposition. So it's in, for some crazy reason, the prime minister's best interest
War.
not to get a ceasefire,
Yeah.
or to let this go on. That's really awful. But that's not our purpose for getting together today. And so what we're going to do is, last week we spent chapter 1 and 2. We spent virtually all of our time on the Sassoons. And this week in chapter 3 and 4, we're going to spend most of our time on the Kadoris. And also on 3 tragic stories about women. If you read through chapter 3 and 4, it's sort of interesting. Let me ask, before we even get started, for reactions to some of the reading. Anybody have any overall reactions, thoughts?
Well,
Elaine?
hasn't there been, what I trying to remember, a very popular and famous, excuse me, dress designer with the last name Sassoon?
No, hair designer.
Yeah, hair designer.
Hair designer, evidently not related.
Yeah, is he a descendant?
No, not related, evidently.
Really?
Yes, I don't remember where it says that, but it does. I remember reading that they are not related.
Yeah, it's toward the end of the book. It
Okay.
says that.
Yeah.
Good for you, Bruce.
Well, my feeling was that it was incredible that they would be able to operate in this way. And on the other hand, it tells the Jewish story that over the centuries, if we've been accepted at all, it's been for those reasons, for being bankers, handling money, handling transactions, but not really being part of the society of the individuals or the countries in which we've lived. So it seems like a recurring story.
Yeah, well, I think the word is marginal. And how are Jews, do they think of themselves as marginal? And are they, instead, because they're Jews, marginal? What's interesting here, and a little note that may have mentioned last week, is that in the introduction, there's this little note where a Chinese man is asked about the Sassoons, and he says he hates them. And so the person who's inquiring says, "Do you hate them because they're Jews?" And he looks quizzically and he says, "No, because they're British." In other words, the fact that they were Jews and Christians are, they're the same thing. I mean, how many Americans, think of yourself, how many Americans can tell you the difference between Buddhists and Hindus? Where, China is a Buddhist country, India is a Hindu country, and there are Jains and there are, all kinds of other. How many of us know really the difference? So it's as foreign, even so there are Christian communities in China today. And somehow these Western ideas are as foreign to them in many ways as they are to us. But let me unless someone has something else they want to share. Let me get into summarizing or retelling the story that we have. First of all, in one generation, the Sassoons get themselves involved in the colonial Indian Legislative Assembly. They get involved with British royalty. They've really made it. And in large part, one of the things that led to their success, as we read last week, was they're engaging in all kinds of technological advances. They invested in steamships. They invested in the telegraph. They invested in modern banks. So in schools to train, they took Baghdadi Jews and they trained them in schools to work in the company. But if you train people to work in the company, you're also going to train rivals. And that's where the Kadoris come in. The Kadoris are from a whole different background. You remember that the Sassoons were their own kind of Jewish royalty in Baghdad for generations and generations. They already started wealthy, and although they have setbacks, they only get wealthier. Well, the Kadoris really, although they are distant cousins of the Sassoons, they really start very different. So 6 sons and 1 daughter, 4 sons go to India after the husband dies from Baghdad. And now one of the challenges in our reading is that all the names are the same. So before we read about Ellis, I think, who is the head of the Sassoons in Shanghai, we now read about Ellie. And not only do we read about Ellie, but then Ellie also has a brother whose name also sounds the same. So Ellie is an apprentice clerk in Hong Kong in the E.D. Sassoon Corporation. And we get a little incident here where he's sent to a small port of a city I'd never heard of before. And there's an outbreak of bubonic plague. And he's evidently in charge. And he goes and uses disinfectant to take care of the bubonic plague. And when it's all over and he's solved the problem, he's criticized for what he did, and he threatens to resign, and he resigns. Well, now he's without a job, and he heads to Hong Kong to his brother Moses. And what does Moses do? Moses gives him $500, I guess dollars, and says, "Don't come back. Do whatever you want with the $500, but don't come back. Don't come back for more." He spent it at the best hotel where he met brokers and traders, and he he forms a company, but rather than use the name Kadori, he makes his company the E.S. Kelly Company.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a statement of his discomfort as a Jew in Hong Kong. He befriends this guy named Robert Hotung, which becomes his partner for a while, who is seemingly of mixed race. He's the richest local businessman, and they invest in the Hong Kong Electric Company. They invest in hotels. They invest in trams, and for whatever reason, he then takes a trip to England. There he meets Frederick Mercado, who's a leader of the Jewish community. He's a Sephardi. Mercado certainly is not an Ashkenazi name. And he's a leader of the London Jewish community. And Mercado introduces Ellie to his niece, Laura, who's an educated aristocrat. She's a little older than he is. She is, if somebody doesn't marry her soon, she's going to become a spinster, a wealthy,
Old maid.
how dare you, an old maid. But this family is a family that had been in Spain. This is a typical Sephardi story. From Spain, they went to Holland. You know, after the Spanish Inquisition, there were Jews who went to North Africa. There are those who went to Turkey. There are those who went to Palestine. But there were those who went to Holland. And when Cromwell opens up England to the Jews have been kicked out in the 13th century. Cromwell opens up England, they go to England. That's the story of the Mercado family. He marries Laura, which was a good catch. And she introduces him to London society. They have two sons who we'll learn about later, Lawrence and Horace.
Hello.
Good,
Who is this?
good British names, right? Lawrence and Horace. Laura goes with Ellie to China, and she goes to Hong
I
Kong.
was in class. What's up?
Phil, you got to put, if you're going to have a conversation, you got to put yourself on mute.
I need to go over some settings.
Phil, can you put yourself on mute?
Yeah, right.
Phil,
So
put yourself
do I.
on mute, please.
Roz went to tell him. Roz went to tell him.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, yeah.
Did you sleep at all?
I need to go over some settings with you to see what.
All right, good. But Hong Kong, she finds very stifling, very British and proper. He, for whatever reason, feels comfortable enough. He drops the Kelly, and he now becomes Ellie, Kadori and Sons. So we have an idea of some sort of comfort there. They supported schools for girls, first in Baghdad, and they supported their brother, who has a project for school for poor Chinese. Ellie has a brother named Ellis. That's not very helpful. Criticize those parents for giving the kids names like these. Laura joins Ellie in Shanghai, and with her sons and a governess. We're going to learn more about that a little later. But Shanghai is a town that smells and is filled with camels and rickshaws. It's not where wives would go. Ellie sends Laura and the boys to London. But while he then has, we learn about this very interesting crisis, right? He takes huge stakes investing in rubber. Why is rubber is rising 20 to 30% a week. Boy, would you like to invest in a company that rises 20 to 30% every week? And why is that? And that's because of the American need for tires. Well, it's a classic bubble. It crashes. The banks demand their payment of their loans. He is bankrupted, and somehow he meets this guy who's involved in charge of the Hong Kong and Shanghai Bank, which is also a Sassoon bank, and he takes him on to renegotiate all these loans. He's asked to consolidate all the rubber loans into bigger companies, which becomes a turning point for Kadori. Had it not been for this, we would not be talking about the Kadoris. He invests where all others got out. He saved these rubber companies from bankruptcy. And Laura comes back from London. She comes to Shanghai. And now we learn a little bit about what's going on in China. Every nation, of course, is taking advantage of China. And there's a need to modernize. Everybody realizes that, and the hero is Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen, to this very day, is somehow a hero in the country. He's a hero among the communists. He's a hero among the nationalists. He's a national hero, and he calls for the overthrow of the emperor and an installation of a democratic Republican government, and the expulsion of Europeans. What's his big break is that the Chinese banks are all of a sudden bankrupted. Why? Because they too have invested in rubber, and the emperor now seized the railroads. And what's the emperor's determination to do? She's going to sell the railroad to the Europeans to pay the debt. There are riots, and the Qing dynasty collapses. And we have the establishment of the Republic of China. Sun Yat-sen is named as its first president. He doesn't last very long. Remember, his part of his program was to modernize, create a democracy of sorts. But the British businessmen made their alliances with the warlords when there was really no, since the central government was really very weak. We then turn back to Ellie. Ellie wants to become a British citizen, and he's rebuffed. He's told he can't become an Israeli citizen. We're now talking about the World War I, and he's from Baghdad. So, citizen of what country is he?
Right.
Baghdad is controlled by the Turks. The Turks are part of the Axis. And so he is now on the wrong side. The French seem to handle the affairs of these stateless people, but nevertheless, he's in a sense a citizen of the Ottoman Empire. So during a family vacation in Canada, he's not allowed back into England, and he flees to Shanghai, and because he's a stateless human being. Laura, in the meantime, increases her charitable work. She with opportunities for women. Helps with people getting to the university. Their son Lawrence wants to become a barrister, and that's his goal. And the other son, Horace, wants to become a gentleman farmer. And you want to tell me what a gentleman farmer is? What's a gentleman farmer? I don't think it's out there with a plow.
He has tenants.
What's that?
He has tenants. He sits in the house and
That's
they
a
do the
gentleman
work.
farmer.
That's
Okay.
a gentleman farmer, yeah.
A farmer who doesn't want to farm.
Who wants to run the business and collect and well, okay, whatever. He
Well-
doesn't explain what a gentleman farmer is, but
I
Bruce?
have a good friend who is a retired physician who is a gentleman farmer. He's in his 80s. He has a huge piece of land, and he grows everything from grapes to vegetables, and he does all the work himself.
well, is he why would you call him a gentleman farmer? Because he's a farmer and a gentleman?
Yes. Because
think
he's a
that's-
pseudo farmer.
I was wondering whether it was people who had people under them who did all the farming,
Yeah.
or whether it was someone who really dealt with the crops, who was the middleman. I don't know. In any event, that was
Family where the Cooks had 200 acres of farmland in New Jersey. And none of the family had anything to do with the land except to live at the summer house there. But they had tenant farmers, and they got a percentage of whatever the farmers sold off. So the attitude of gentlemen farmers was to accrue land and benefit from that accrual.
well, after the Civil War, people weren't enslaved, but they re-enslaved
Sharecropping.
blacks by making them, they didn't call them tenant farmers, they called them sharecroppers,
Yeah.
right? I guess sharecropper was the same thing, depending on how much of an advantage you take of the people who are farming. Our chapter ends with this very tragic story of a mansion that that Ellie bought, and there's a fire
And
in the mansion.
where is this? Where is he living? In Shanghai?
In Shanghai. In Shanghai, and there's a fire, and Ellie gets out, Laura gets out, the kids get out, but Laura is convinced that the governess is still in the house. So she goes back into the house. The governess actually is out, but she's the one who suffocates. And the family returns to England. That's the end of what happens in chapter 3. So it's very, very tragic, because I think she's a very sympathetic figure, and she really creates all these opportunities for Ellie with her connections in England and her father's connections. So Sun Yat-sen lasts only a few months. He's replaced by, he resigns, he's replaced by a general who decides to call himself emperor. Not a good idea. And by 1915, he lasts only a short time and he abdicates. So the country is seemingly now controlled by warlords, except that you have foreigners running these major cities, these business guys, and they've created a stable government in Shanghai. The Americans, the British, and the French concession. By the way, there's still an area that's called the French concession in Shanghai. Nice restaurants there. And it's run by these panels of businessmen, including the Sassoons. Shanghai, certain area of Shanghai near the water there is cleaned up along the Bund. They institute new technology, transportation, gaslighting, running water, villas. These men's spouses come, Western women and servants. So in 1920, by 1920, which is after the First World War, there are now 40,000 foreigners and 1 million Chinese who are living in this international settlement, and 2 million in a Chinese-controlled part of the city. Now, today, it's so crazy. You travel in China and they don't understand cities with 500,000, 750,000. I mean, the cities are 30 million, 40 million people. I mean, the cities are so enormous. But here he had, this was a pretty big operation. And a lot of the Chinese had desires to work for rich foreigners or these Chinese companies, which were operating the same way that the foreign companies were. And they even had a film industry. It was, some freedom of dissent was allowed in this area, which was not allowed in other areas of China. And so you had political radicals who were intrigued to coming to this area. And among them was Mao and Chou Enlai, who lived in the international settlement. And they met there to create revolution. Even so, Shanghai was called the Paris of the Orient. How many? Can you raise your? How many of you have been to China? Okay, and one of the things that you see is the separation between the modern parts of cities and the old parts of cities, which are called the hutongs. And the hutongs are really very small, almost no, no roads going through. They're disappearing one after the other as they modernize. But you can really see, or you can imagine what Shanghai was like as these foreigners sort of modernize a certain area of the city, and the rest of the Chinese are living in squalor in these hutongs. So Ellie's sons, Lawrence enrolls in London Law School. Horace is interested in agriculture or architecture, but Ellie didn't fit. He somehow was an outsider in London. He has no polish, and he's a Jewish outsider. He's a good guy, I think. No polish, maybe, but good guy. Ellie's brother, Ellis. Would you ever name your kids Ellie and Ellis? That's crazy. I actually had a family in my former congregation where one brother was Edgar and the other was Edward. I didn't ever understood that either, how you could name your two sons Edward and Edgar. But his brother Ellis dies in Hong Kong with a stake in luxury hotels in Shanghai and Beijing. He's invested in the electric company in Hong Kong and South China. He's invested in rubber companies. He has stock holdings, and somehow Ellie has to take care of this enormous holdings. So he goes back to Shanghai with his sons. He there builds the city's largest mansion, which is modeled on Versailles. It's called Marble Hall, and there's several things here. Let me look. 84. He had several Rolls Royces in that. Ellie's a good guy, but I think he's really a dictator when it comes to his sons.
Yeah, but the Sassoons were too.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
That's no excuse. 80. So here, the Kadoris announced 84. Kadoris announced the family's return to Shanghai by building the city's largest mansion, modeled on the royal palace at Versailles, outside Paris, where the Allies had just held a peace conference that ended World War I. Marble Hall was twice the size of any existing home in Shanghai and sat just down the street from the more modest home of Jordan's William Keswick, whose executives often mocked Ellie and his family. The veranda along the front of Marble Hall stretched 220 feet, longer than a city block. A series of garages held several Rolls Royces. Inside the ballroom was 80 feet long. That's the ballroom, 80 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 65 feet high, with 3,600 electric bulbs, goodness gracious, glittering from the ceiling. A visitor counted more than 4 dozen sofas in the ballroom, living rooms and parlors. The dining room could seat 50. There were 12 bedrooms, though just 3 people lived in the house: Ellie, Lawrence, and Horace, attended by 42 servants. They ate their meals at a small table set up in the corner of the vast dining room. This is a little description of this. There he hosted Charles Lindbergh as he went around the world. There were shows, and he also then, across the street from the house where his wife died, he builds the biggest and fanciest hotel called the Majestic Hotel. And in Hong Kong, he then also builds the Peninsula. Now, the Peninsula is still today the fanciest hotel in Hong Kong. And what people do, poor pikers like us, is you try and get in to go for tea. We never got in for tea, but I have no idea what the rooms go for. But it's, the Peninsula still still is, and I think there's a peninsula in Hong Kong. I think there's peninsula in other cities as well. I don't remember where. But the Majestic is open to all, which is very unusual. It serves only the best French food, American entertainers, celebrities came. Douglas Fairbanks and Mary Pickford were there. He's a big macher. He's probably not as wealthy as the Sassoons, but he wants to show off like he is. He's involved in charitable giving, hospitals. He underwrites hospitals in England, France, Constantinople, the Middle East, schools for girls. And finally, in 1926, he gets British citizenship and knighthood, not just citizenship, knighthood. He gets a place on corporate boards. And he buys stock in the Shanghai Land Company, which is the biggest real estate company in China. He took control of the company. He invited the Sassoons to join. There's a rivalry going on between these two families. He took control of the Shanghai Gas Company and puts his son Horace on the board. Horace becomes the chair. And now we have a short interlude about Zionism, right? The Sassoons kept their distance from Zionism. They were British through and through. By the way, the Rothschilds in the very beginning, when Herzl came to the Rothschilds for money, they didn't give him any money. Why didn't they give him any money? Because they feared that it would undermine their French citizenship, that people would say they were not loyal to France. Well, eventually the Rothschilds give quite a bit of finances to Israel. They build, among other things, they build the Knesset. I think they build their money also is behind the beautiful Supreme Court building. But the Sassoons stay away from Zionism. But Ellie is more connected. He donates money with his brother to the Hebrew University for land. He turns to Sun Yat-sen for support at the issue of the Balfour Declaration in 1917. They then, Jonathan Kaufman, by the way, Bruce sent me the address of Jonathan Kaufman. I have written to him and invited him to come to our class and speak to us. He hasn't gotten back to me yet. Bruce, I don't know how long it took you when you wrote to him, how long it took him to get back to you. Did it take a while?
It took a couple days.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm waiting. I may write to him again. There's a section here where it talks about the Jews that are the oldest Jews in China, which are the Jews who live in Kaifeng. That he says they were there since the 15th century. There are those who say that these Jews in Kaifeng and Kerala have gone to Kaifeng, which is nowhere near. It's really in the middle of China. They have disappeared. Even so, there's interest now among some of the descendants of these Jewish families to re-explore their Judaism.
Didn't Rabbi Reisa, isn't that where Rabbi Stanford went?
Rabbi Stanford also went there to Kaifeng as well. We had some very interesting experiences there. In a book, I might just divert for a second. In a book that I had, it said that the things left over from the Jewish community are in the museum. So I went to the museum, and I'm walking around the museum, and it says it's on the third, the stuff is on the third floor. So I go through the first floor, I go through the second floor. There's no third floor, except there's a door. And two young teenagers want to practice their English. So they say to me, can I help you? And I said, yes, I'm looking for a way to get to the third floor for the Jewish artifacts. And they take me downstairs to the administration office, and they ask in Chinese, and the woman says, well, you'll have to pay. I said, I'm willing to pay. So she goes with her key and unlocks the door and takes me upstairs, and there it is. There are two stelae that were in front of the synagogue. They're in Chinese, of course. And the most, for me, and certain other artifacts are there. To me, the most exciting part was on the wall was a drawing of what the interior of the synagogue looked like, just a, like a plan, and another drawing of what the whole property looked like. This was done by Jesuit priests who had come, and the Jesuit priests had a motive. The Jesuit priests wanted to have a copy, wanted to get a copy of the Torah from them. The Kaifeng Jewish community would not sell them a Torah. They would let them look at the Torah. And the reason that they wanted a Torah is that there are claims in the Christian scripture in the New Testament of verses that are in the Torah that are not in the Torah. So there was a feeling that Jews had cut out certain verses out of the Torah, and that if they got to, and this old community, which had been separated from the Jewish community for hundreds of years, must have the unabridged Torah. So they would copy out large sections, not knowing Hebrew at all. They would copy out large sections, and of course, they never found sections of the Torah where those Torahs, by the way, some are in the British Museum, and I think there are about 8 Torahs, and they're in different places around the world. Even so, there's no Jewish community there anymore. I'm not sure exactly why he threw this in here, but I found it interesting. Sun Yat-sen sympathized with the Jews wanting their own country in the same way that he wanted. He thought there was a parallel, and he wrote a letter of support to Ellie, and Ellie offered to buy bonds to support the new government. I'm not sure who was there first, but Horace, the younger son, becomes in charge of the social calendar in Marble Hall, parties and charity work. Lawrence, who isn't such a happy camper, oversees the trips. He becomes his father's private secretary. He's a better businessman, and he eventually takes over the Hong Kong businesses. A short little interlude. We read that Ellie donated to evidently a large sum of money to a Palestine garden city. And when he got there, he saw that the money was used for other things. So he became very disgruntled. He quit as head of the Shanghai Zionists. Unlike the Rothschilds, whose name appears in many places and whose projects did, you wonder if this was prejudice against them because they were Sephardim, but evidently the money that was designated for something never got used. In 1928, he brought Lawrence onto the board of the China Power and Light Company in Hong Kong, and eventually made Lawrence the board chair. Harsh poverty in Shanghai Ellie is more charitable. He builds several schools to educate poor children, especially girls. In 1920, Mao comes to Shanghai. He denounces foreign occupation, and there's a first Communist Congress there. This will become very important later on. We turn back to the Sassoons, who have 8 sons. David, the father of these sons, dies in 1864. Most of the rest of the sons go to live in London. Why do they go to live in London? Because they have money and they like to live the rich life. Elias, who's not Ellie. Ellie is the Kaduri. Elias is a Sassoon, and he's running his own business. E.D. Sassoon. He's secluded in. The rest of the family are seduced by London, their lavish lifestyles, and then all of a sudden there's a crisis. The crisis is that, and here's the story of the 2 women. Solomon dies. Solomon is in India, and nobody wants to go to India to take over the business. So his wife, who is his niece, who is Solomon's niece, he marries his niece. His wife says, she announces, I'll take over. I'll run the business. And she says that she'll run the business until her oldest is old enough to run the business. She's actually a descendant. She's just 35. Solomon, who died, was considerably older. And she is capable and beloved and runs the business and makes money. The brothers agreed to this arrangement, assured that she was easy to control and she would be a figurehead. But that's not who she became. She was discreet, because running a business is not what women did in India. But she was very affable.
This doesn't work.
Since opium was declining, she shifted the business to selling copper, tea, silver, and spices, and was an enormous success until
it doesn't work for you.
Until the bubonic plague is followed by cholera breaks out, and she has to shut down certain developments. She supports the development of a cholera vaccine. Even so, there were those in India who the religious groups, it sounds familiar, I guess, who opposed the vaccine on religious grounds. She had to shut down some of the businesses, and the family in London starts complaining. She becomes isolated, and in 1901, the brothers shut out Flora. They changed the corporation, that she's completely shut out of the business. She goes to London, where she has better medical care for her disabled daughter, and that's the end of Flora. Flora, who is much beloved. The end of our story is about Rachel Sassoon. Rachel Sassoon is 30. She has a brother who went to Oxford. Her brothers went to Oxford. She is a woman, so she doesn't get higher education. She rebels, and she's left she's supposed to marry a Baghdadi. That's what her father had told her that she must do. She refuses. She's left a trust fund. She trains as a nurse, and at 30, already an old maid, She marries a German tycoon who was born Jewish, who converted to Christianity, and she also converts to Christianity. This guy owns a Sunday weekly, and she's now interested in journalism. Her husband buys her her own newspaper, the Sunday Times. She becomes editor-in-chief of both newspapers. And we have a little episode here. She becomes very interested in the Dreyfus affair. Dreyfus affair happens to be a particular interest of mine, and what she writes is really not a description of the Dreyfus affair. What Jonathan Kaufman writes, the Dreyfus affair. She supports Dreyfus, who was convicted. It says he was convicted on forged documents. He wasn't convicted on forged documents. He was convicted on documents that they attributed to him. Even so, and so he was convicted as a traitor for having written the bordereau, this document. But she becomes very interested in that story. She defends the Sassoon opium trade. Her husband dies. She becomes depressed. She behaves erratically. She was declared insane, and she dies in 1927. Very, very peculiar story. Chiang Kai-shek is suppresses the communists. He becomes a new leader in Bombay. He visits Shanghai, and we end the story with the introduction of the next and very powerful leader of the Sassoon family, whose name is Victor. And we will be involved with Victor now for a while. He's quite a dandy that we have with Victor. Here we have the story of these two families. Certainly the Sassoons are wealthier, but the Kadoris are really movers and shakers. Any thoughts on all of this?
So these are both Sephardi families.
Both from Baghdad, yes.
Where the Ashkenazic here?
They're not in Asia. Even so, there are Americans that have come to Asia, and that's why, when one of the reasons that this becomes an important story is because so much of our history books on Jewish history are focused almost entirely on Ashkenazim. And there's so much history really regarding the Sephardim, religious history, political history, economic history, that these are, these guys have set up headquarters in cities all throughout Asia, and they're doing business.
Oh, wait a minute. Rabbi?
Yeah.
Why are they considered Sephardic? They were not part of the being expelled from Spain. They've been...
They were not, and therefore the Sephardim are, the world is usually divided Ashkenazim and Sephardim. But actually, Sephardim are divided into Sephardim, those who have whose families originated in Spain, and Mizrachim. So Mizrachim simply means Easterners, and so, for instance, the Yemenite Jews are Mizrachim, not Sephardim. I mean, they're all bunched together.
What about Moroccan?
The Moroccan Jews are, for the most part, Sephardim.
Yeah,
Sephardim, not
Sephardim. They're from
right.
They were
where did the Spanish Jews go? Spanish Jews went to North Africa, So Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, all had Jewish communities.
Netherlands.
They went to Holland, yes. They went to Turkey. They were welcomed.
Ottoman Empire.
The Turks couldn't understand. The Turks welcomed these Jews because the Jews knew how to do business and trade. They were very, very valuable, and the Turks couldn't understand why the Christians didn't want them. It's interesting that from Spain, and many of them went to Portugal, but they got kicked out of Portugal. From Spain and Portugal, some of them came to the New World. Right, the very first Jews, I think we talked about this last week, the very first Jews who land in New York are Jews who, 23 or 26 Jews who were living in Recife, Brazil. And this Inquisition arrives in Brazil, and they flee from Brazil, and they land in New York. So these Jews, some of them moved north to France. And a very interesting story that I wrote up recently, that 1789 is the French Revolution. What do we know about, what are the themes of the French Revolution?
Liberty, equality, and fraternity.
Liberty, equality, fraternity, right? But they had no idea whether that applied to Jews. So they have debates about whether liberty, equality, fraternity applies to Jews. In 1790, they decide that yes, it applies to Sephardic Jews in southern France, not to Ashkenazi Jews in the north, in Alabama. Why? Because the Sephardic Jews in the south were not moneylenders. The Jews in the north, in Alsace, who could not own land, who could not be part of the guilds, they largely became moneylenders. So it's not till 1791 that the Jews in northern France are given citizenship after huge debate. And part of the debate is that the liberals say, famous line, nothing for the Jews as a nation, everything for the Jews as individuals. In other words, as long as those Jews don't function as Jews, they can have citizenship. That was the liberal position.
I have a question about the Sassoons. It's said in the 1800s when they were there that they had been there for 800 years. So that takes us back to 1,000. So where were they before that? Were they part of the Babylonian exile that brought Jews, in 586 to BC to that area of the world? It just went back 800 years of power. So I thought, okay, so what about 1,000 years before that? Like, how did they get there in the first place?
Yeah, that probably part of the Babylonian exile.
Yeah,
but they don't have records that go any further back. Probably
the records are 800 years old of their wealth and power.
Mizrahi Jews.
It's Muhammad is in the 7th century, and the Muslims capture North Africa, capture Arabia, North Africa, and the Middle East. There in the 7th and 8th centuries, and they become the
Iran to India is nothing.
So tell me, Ms.
Rabbi?
Yep.
I have a question. When we were in Italy, I remember, especially in Rome, visiting the Jewish community, I remember they referred to themselves as Italian Jews, that they did not really classify themselves as either Sephardic or Ashkenazi. So Where does that come from?
I'm not sure, but I know there's actually a Nusach Italki. There's actually a whole separate traditions that apply to Italian Jews.
Mhm.
And I think they're largely have their origins in Spain as well. But they were in Italy for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So maybe there's Italian Jews. The Jews were kicked out of France. The Jews were kicked out of England. The Jews were kicked out of Spain. I don't know that the Jews were ever kicked out of Italy.
No, they could have been there from the time that the Romans
brought them
the
over.
Roman
Yeah.
Empire.
Yeah.
That's entirely possible.
Back to the Roman Empire, and therefore they identify with that. I remember hearing that somewhere.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah.
It was very interesting though, and certainly the Italian Jewish cooking is wonderful. I love it.
So before we leave, there's one thing about the Americans in China. And the Americans were a big presence in China, but they weren't an economic presence. What they did was they sent missionaries all the hell over the place, so that there was Yale in China. And there were many, many other institutions that were all missionary institutions.
Franciscans and others. Famous story about how this community in the Jewish community is discovered. They've been cut off from the Jewish community for hundreds of years, and there's a true story about a fellow who lives in Kaifeng. And the reason that they come to Kaifeng originally is because this was the capital of the Sung dynasty in the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries. It's an area that gets flooded almost all the time. But nevertheless, there was a fellow who was working for the government who makes his way from Kaifeng to Beijing because he wants to apply for an advancement. In Beijing, he hears that there's a group of people who believe in one God. And he goes and checks out these people, and they are, I don't know if they were Jesuits or what I have to look up again. And he meets this priest, and they have this conversation that's sort of like talking past each other, because this Jewish fellow has never heard of Christians before, and the Christian can't conceive of the fact that there are Jews. So they have this very strange conversation. But that's how this Jewish community in Kaifeng is discovered. And while the rest of the Jewish world is basically disinterested in these Jews of Kaifeng, those Christian missionaries, for the reason that I explained before, are very interested in the Jews in Kaifeng. The ones who are left actually become Confucians. In Kaifeng, the only thing that's left of the Jewish community, aside from what's in the museum, is on the spot where the synagogue stood, there's a hospital, and they can take you to a spot, and you look through a building, and there's a hole in the ground, and they say that was the mikveh. And that's the only thing of the synagogue. The Jews totally disappeared about the 1880s, 1890s.
I remember Rabbi Stanford saying that there was a Jew street, that there was a name like it was in Chinese, but basically that's what it said.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if the Jew street still exists. They put up a sign actually in Chinese near that hospital. I think it was subsequently taken down. But very interesting fact. We're not really sure how the Jews got there. There are different theories how the Jews got to China. But like the Yemenite Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, they didn't realize that there were other Jews in the world, and the Jews in the rest of the world didn't know that they were there.
Rabbi, were they Chinese or were they?
They look Chinese.
Yes.
Oh,
They actually look Chinese. So I hope I'll hear this week from Jonathan Kaufman. I think next week we're simply going to read just chapter 5. Just chapter 5, which is about Victor, which is a little longer chapter. I spaced these out so that the reading is about 50 pages a week.
okay.
So let's hope and pray that there's a
Peace.
ceasefire in Israel.
Yeah.
One of the things that in the Yad B'Yad presentation, that one of the teachers said, made a comment about the rioting of Jews against Arab citizens and Arabs against Jews. He said, we have to understand that this is extremists versus moderates, that we Jews have our own extremists, many of them from the territories, from the settlements.
I think so.
And Arabs also have their extremists, that the vast majority of Israeli Jews and Israeli Arabs are considered moderates. They're not out in the streets, and that these things that have taken place in Lud and in other places are the extremists. And the extremists on both sides are a big problem in Israel.
What are you looking at?
A Hummer.
Where?
It's got that white.
Oh,
Okay,
Okay.
ladies and gentlemen, we will adjourn, and I'll see you all next week. Thank you for coming.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Be well.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just leave.
Thanks.
Okay.